Good evening, Keith. It's Hannah here again. Firstly, I would like to present to you the next slide. Now, this covers the examples that I talked about at the end of the last video in regards to financial accounting. However, the computer unfortunately just did not swap it through. Now, however, we are up to performance accounting. Now, financial accounting in the context of government also requires in-depth performance accounting. Performance accounting sets performance requirements either in monetary or non-monetary terms. Monetary terms would be in regards to is our tax revenue being spent efficiently with minimal transaction costs, and non-monetary would be are the services that the government is providing for us relevant to Kiwis today. So some examples of performance accounting in action in the executive branch, as you can see on the slides, are as follows: budget submissions, receiving oral accounts, answers to questions and engaging in debate, gathering and monitoring performance outputs, setting performance output targets, review of past, present, and contemplating and forecasting the future. Taxation and planning, chains of responsibility and accountability, financial and performance accounting. All three concepts are essential for the effective operation of the executive. Even so, problems arise. One of the main concerns that's received many critiques is the accountability system set up currently in place in New Zealand. Now, the accountability system is described as the check part of the public management model. It allows performance to be checked. It also allows for responsibility to be delegated, as it is assumed the responsibility receivers will be held accountable. Accountability of government branches and employees is essential to maintaining the effective operations of government, so when a problem in the accountability system occurs, it can be highly problematic, as there are many stakeholders involved in New Zealand public services, from citizens, employees, ministers, to firms. Now, in recent years, there have been concerns about the fundamental structure of our accountability system. Feedback has indicated that this relates mainly to the utility and proliferation of accountability documents and the ex-ante and ex-post processes involved. This has been highlighted due to the confidentiality breaches of late, including Bryce Edwards, a freelance journalist. Bryce Edwards was able to access individuals' private information from a WINZ kiosk. He then downloaded a small proportion of that information and went and released it to the public and discussed this in the media. Now, the list continues with ACC, MSD, IRD, and EQC all releasing private information of about 100,000 New Zealanders. This is 100,000 Kiwis have had governmental agencies release private information about them to others. Due to these breaches, drawing attention to our current accountability system in regards to information processing and handling, the State Services Commission, the SSC, was responsible for reviewing the accountability system, and it called this review the Improving Accountability Project. The main issue identified was in fact confidentiality documents. The proposed solution was to streamline sensitive documents altogether. It was quickly realised, however, that the documents were just the visible parts of a complex system of formal and informal systems and processes that make up the current accountability and performance management systems. The majority of critiques were not isolated exclusively to the accountability system, but were manifestations of wider problems. This revelation is due to the accountability system overlapping with the performance management system, and the two being indistinguishable in some areas. For example, ex-ante accountability documentation is about establishing goals and objectives, an essential feature of also the performance management system. but the accountability system imposes a large amount of transaction costs, some of which are inevitable because public accountability must satisfy the requirements for probity and transparency. The Improving Accountability Project has focused on the accountability relationships covered within the executive, between the departmental chief executives and the ministers, and to a lesser extent between the executive and Parliament. This focus was derived from a significant amount of criticism and feedback from stakeholders about the operation of the accountability system in specific regards to these relationships. Critiques about the current accountability system are listed as followed. Professor Alan Sheik, who has also reviewed the current public management system and focused on accountability as one of the most important elements of a result-based public management system. Sheik applauded the extent to which the architects of the New Zealand reforms had taken accountability seriously. However, he commented that he had concerns about how accountability had been built into the system, indicating the wider fundamental problems that were discussed earlier. He stated that basing accountability upon the ex-ante specification of performance can have unanticipated consequences, as when unspecified matters escape accountability. And whereas in other jurisdictions, certain actions and outcomes fall between the cracks of the accountability system because managers are sometimes unsure of what they are responsible for. In New Zealand, they sometimes fall between the cracks because managers know precisely what they are responsible for. Sheik is not the only one to raise these concerns. These relatively persuasive concerns throughout all people reviewing the current system. Now, Parliament's Finance and Expenditure Committee, in an inquiry also, raised concerns about both the ex-ante and post-accountability information. It asked for more essentially non-financial ex-post information to be included in departmental annual reports, and expressed dissatisfaction with the ex-ante departmental forecast report, which it recommended be abolished altogether. Ministers have also suggested that accountability documentation is difficult to use and they often do not have enough time to read, let alone digest and consider the various information sets provided. As a result, they have trouble getting an overall picture of the department's performance. Now, this can cause serious issues as the ministers are responsible for representing their departments to the public, so they must be able to understand what exactly is going on. Now, there is also the central agencies have provided feedback that they themselves are uncomfortable about the burden on departments that the accountability system exerts, about whether the right information and behaviour is being generated by current accountability arrangement, and about their own ability to assure ministers, Parliament and the public that public resources are in fact being well managed and directed towards the right ends that benefit stakeholders fairly. Now, these concerns were formally expressed in the 1994 report on the Working Party to the Advisory Group on the Review of Accountability Requirements, and an SSC report assessment of the state of New Zealand public services, which recommended a more mature system that allowed for more complex judgments rather than just the heavy emphasis on the measurable. As I stated before, there was a large shift in focus in recent decades in the accountability system on defining job roles and defining outputs. This, however, has been critiqued, saying that it's too simplified and that a more complex view needs to also be incorporated. Now, the Office of the Controller and Auditor General also suggested that Parliament should receive more information on the government's desired outcomes and the extent to which they are being achieved or not achieved. They also want information on organisational capability, on ownership-related issues, on how the executive's agents assess and manage risk, and on how the executive proposes to impress supply. Most of this information is absent from the current accountability documents and the information requirements set in place for reporting. Now, I've outlined the many problems to do with the current accountability system, but it must be noted that it is still as such a very competent system, and there are many praises throughout the world and New Zealand on how much of a strong focus our country puts on the accountability to make sure that there's a certain level of fairness and transparency for our country, as New Zealand is a country that is very much into pro rights of everyone. Now, the reason that I chose to discuss the accountability system and the issues pertaining to it is that it is an integral part of all three aspects covered in this presentation. Chains of responsibility cannot be established unless those involved understand their accountability and place within the chain. Accountability cannot be facilitated without appropriate planning, and financial and performance accounting especially depend on clear accountability systems. Otherwise, there is no actual way to measure performance on using the infrastructure. This was also the general opinion observed from other classmates that I discussed with, that accountability was pivotal in the executive and a large area of many people's focus, as it tied into all three aspects in some way. Due to this, I spoke about it because any fundamental problems in our current accountability system can have governmental-wide issues. Now, Keith, that's the end of my presentation, and I would just like to thank you for listening, and have a good evening.